I still remember the sound before the silence. It wasn't an explosion. It was the absence of everything, as if the world had decided to hold its breath at the same time as us. And in that empty space, in that interval that couldn't fit on any clock, 3 words almost got lost in the wind. I didn't know it yet, but they were already passing through me. My ear was ringing, my mouth was dry, and my hands were shaking without permission. Have you ever felt your body keep functioning while your mind lags behind? I stepped on the ground, but I couldn't feel the ground. I was breathing, but I didn't recognize the air. And the strangest thing is that nobody was shouting at that moment. There were no orders. There was no chaos. Just a strange calm. A calm that didn't fit the place where we were. It was there that I realized that silence can also be a form of attack. I looked at the faces around me and saw men who were still alive, but they were already gone inside. Have you ever looked at someone like that? Someone who is still there, but is no longer. And then came the whisper. It didn't come high. It didn't come firm. It didn't come heroic. It arrived fragile, human vain. He came almost afraid to exist. 3 words. Just that 3 words. They weren't asking for attention. They weren't demanding obedience. They were just trying to survive the wind. I didn't understand what they meant at the time, but my body understood before my head, and it moved. Alone. Do you believe that? Sometimes the body knows before the soul. I took a step, then another, without knowing exactly where I was going. It wasn't courage. It wasn't a strategy. It was instinct trying not to die. It was a memory trying not to disappear. Something inside me was telling me that I still needed to keep going, even without knowing why. The sound returned gradually, first distant, then closer, then unbearable, and along with it, the awareness that I was still there, but something had been left behind, something I was never able to pick up completely again, because after that, silence was never just silence again. It became a memory. It became a threat. It became company. I got home later, with my body functioning, but with parts of me still stuck in that space between one sound and another. Do you have a place like that too? A moment when everything changed but nobody noticed? Sometimes people talk about war as if it were just noise, explosions, fire, but they never talk about that space. From this void, from that second when you realize you might not come back. Or worse, it could come back different. Those 3 words continue to resonate within me to this day. Not like a scream, but as a reminder. It was there that something inside me began to break, and at the same time, began to hold on. I haven't told this to almost anyone, because how else can you explain that a whisper can carry an entire platoon? How can we explain that 3 words can save bodies and wound souls? And maybe that's why I still hear that wind sometimes, when everything seems too quiet, as if he were still trying to tell me something, as if those words still hadn't finished being understood. And maybe that's why I still hear that wind sometimes, and when everything seems too quiet, not as a sound, but as a presence. It was as if something was trying to remind me of who I was before, and who I could never be again afterward. I try not to think about it when I wake up, but it comes along with the coffee, with the mirror, with the way I avoid looking at myself for too long. Do you do that too? Avoid lingering too long in front of certain memories, as if they could move on their own. People think that the return is a place, a house, a familiar street, but the return is a state, and sometimes it never happens completely. I walk the same sidewalks. I greet the same people. I smile when expected, but inside, I'm still in that interval, between sound and silence, between order and whispering, between who I was and who I still don't know how to be. I've learned to live with it, not to understand it, because understanding would require acceptance, and accepting it still hurts. There are days when I think those 3 words didn't save me. They only postponed something. Perhaps the fall, perhaps the collapse, perhaps the question I've never been able to answer. Who am I now? And when someone asks me how it was out there, I almost always answer very little. Not for lack of memory, but due to excess, because there are things that can't be contained in sentences. And maybe you're feeling it now, even without having lived what I've lived. Perhaps you too carry something you can't explain, something that got stuck between 2 moments. If that's the case, you don't need to say much. Sometimes a period is already a way of speaking. Sometimes silence is also an answer. If you want, You can leave any word that's still trying to exist inside you down here. Or just a sign, so I know you're there. Because I'm also trying to learn not to go through this alone. And if you feel like continuing to walk with me through these twisted memories, through these stories that don't quite come together, stick around. Not by me for you. Because maybe we don't need answers right now. Just company. I still hear those 3 words, not as salvation, but as a question. And maybe, just maybe, I'm still trying to understand what they were really asking for. Or what are they still asking for? Even today, even now, even here. I didn't know a whisper could cut through so much dust, so much fear, so many people broken inside. I used to think that only big things had an impact. Explosions, orders, shouting. But there, in that spot where nobody wanted to look, it was an almost insignificant thing that changed everything. A whisper has no power in movies. He won no medals. It doesn't become a speech. But he crosses. He finds cracks. He goes where the noise doesn't go. I've seen men trained to endure anything crumble inside without making a sound. I saw decisions being made without words. I saw eyes pleading for permission to continue breathing. And there I was, trying to understand at what point my identity had started to slip away from all of that. Because it's not just the body that comes back. The memory returns earlier. She gets ahead. She asserts herself. She doesn't ask for permission. Sometimes I can still smell that place, even when I'm sitting in a regular diner, in some random city in the United States, surrounded by people talking about small things, as if small things were still possible. Have you ever noticed how life here moves at 2 different paces? One for those who have never been, another one for those who never came back whole. I walk through empty parking lots at night and think about what's going on behind the scenes, not the ones from theaters, but those of one's own mind, where the hidden truth repeats itself without an audience, where no one applauds, where nobody corrects, where nobody says everything is all right. And sometimes I wish someone would say, not to save me, but to confirm that I still exist, because after that, I started to doubt my own existence. I was in the places, but it wasn't part of the conversations. I smiled, but he didn't recognize the reason. I replied, but I didn't feel the question. Do you understand this? The feeling of continuing to live without being sure if you are still participating in your own story. People like to talk about transformation as if it were a beautiful moment, as if she had music, as if it had light. But my transformation happened in silence. In a silence that no one noticed, in a silence that was not shared, in a silence that has not yet ended. It was there that I realized we weren't going home. We just changed the scenery, and we try to pretend that we are the same person. I started noticing details that weren't there before. The way someone holds a glass, the time it takes someone to respond, the space between one word and another. Because it is in this space that the hidden truth resides. That's where the memory slips away. It is there that identity trembles. Sometimes I find myself watching ordinary people making simple decisions, choosing a path, choosing a place, choose a time, and I think about how my mind still turns everything into survival. To this day, until now, even when there is no danger, even when everything seems safe, even when life says it's already over, the body still disagrees, memory still disagrees, silence still disagrees. I try to be fair to myself. I try not to put so much pressure on myself. But there are days when I feel like I'm stuck in a version of myself that no one else can see. A version that only appears when I'm alone, when nobody's looking, when I don't need to appear strong, when I don't need to look good, when I don't need to explain anything. And perhaps that's where the biggest impact lies. Not in what happened outside, but what continued to happen here inside without witnesses. No record. Without an organized narrative. Only fragments. Only sensations. Just questions. I've already tried to organize this in my head. I've already tried giving them names. I've already tried putting it into sentences. But there's always something left over. Something always slips through the cracks. There's always a part left without a caption. And perhaps that's why I still hear that whisper. Not as a souvenir, but as a movement. As if he were still crossing over. Going through my days, my decisions, my silences, my way of loving, my way of trusting, my way of existing. Because after that moment, I learned that not everything that saves brings peace. Some things are saved simply so that you have time to learn to live with what's left, with what has changed, with what doesn't come back, with what cannot be explained. And perhaps that's what scares me the most. Not what happened, but what continues to happen, behind the scenes of my own story, as I continue walking down ordinary streets, living ordinary days, speaking common words, with a silence that was never common, and with an identity that is still trying to understand at what point it ceased to be whole. If this touched a part of your memory, tell me in the comments what still resonates with you. My body was whole, but something in me had already been left on that ground. It wasn't possible to pinpoint where. It wasn't possible to measure. It was impossible to explain. It was like losing a shadow without realizing it. She simply doesn't keep up anymore, and nobody notices. I was walking normally. I used to sit normally, he spoke normally. But memory no longer obeyed time. It appeared in places that had no connection. In supermarket aisles, empty gas stations in the early morning, in waiting rooms with a television on too low. And I would stay there, still inside myself, while the world went on. Have you ever had the feeling of being behind within your own body? As if something had left before you. And now you were just trying to reach. I started to realize that the impact doesn't come immediately. He comes next, when nobody else is looking, when no one else asks, when the hidden truth begins to move on its own. Behind the scenes of the mind, in the corners of memory, in the details that nobody notices. I was trying to remember what I felt first. Fear, anger, relief. But everything seemed mixed up, like a blurry photograph, like an interrupted sentence, like an identity that hasn't finished forming. I heard people talking about going back home as if it were the end of the world. But for me it was always a comma, a long pause, a silence that never ended. I would arrive at the places, but it didn't arrive whole. I answered questions, but it didn't respond internally. And every time someone said I looked good, something inside me recoiled, because I didn't know if I was lying to them. Or for me, decisions started to slow down, not out of indecision, but due to excessive awareness. I was thinking about everything, in every possibility, in each consequence, as if any choice could send me back to that ground, even without any connection, even if it makes no sense because logic doesn't control memory. She's just trying to survive inside herself. I started noticing that I was avoiding certain sounds, certain lights, certain tones of voice, and when someone asked why, I had no answer. All I knew was that my whole body was reacting to things my head had already forgotten, or pretending to forget. Do you understand how this confuses identity? You start to doubt your own reactions. You begin to doubt your own intuition. He begins to wonder if he's still who he thought he was. I would look at old photos and feel like I was looking at someone else, someone who existed before certain layers, before certain silences, before certain unannounced changes, because nobody tells you when you change. Nobody sets a date. Nobody recognizes the moment. You only realize it later, when it's too late to go back. I was trying to tell parts of the story to some people, but it always stopped halfway, not for lack of words, but due to a lack of translation. How can you explain that something can save you, and at the same time separate you from who you were? How can we explain that surviving is also a form of loss? I started writing in notebooks, not complete sentences, just loose words, impact, silence, identity, memory, decisions behind the scenes, transformation, hidden truth I didn't organize. I was just recording, as if I were trying to prove to myself that it still existed, that I still existed, that it hadn't just been an invented break. Sometimes I would close my notebook and just stare at it as if it were a door that I still didn't have the courage to open completely, because I knew that behind her there were no answers, only continuity. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to keep feeling. Have you ever been afraid of understanding something? Not because of the pain, but because of the change that this understanding would bring. I began to realize that it was no longer possible to separate what remained on that ground from what was now walking with me. They had become mixed up. They had made a silent agreement. I would follow, but never alone within myself. And that tired me out. Not physically, but existentially. I was getting tired of trying to appear simple. I was getting tired of trying to explain so little. I was tired of pretending to be carefree. It was tiring carrying invisible layers. I would look at the sky some nights and feel the urge to ask things that had no form, questions without structure, questions without language, questions that only existed as feelings, as a weight, as an absence, like a desire to understand, and at the same time, a desire not to understand, Because understanding would mean accepting that something within me had truly been left behind, and accepting it was still difficult. Perhaps it still is. I don't know if I lost something on that floor, or if I let it. Perhaps it was an unconscious choice. Perhaps it was simply the price of continuing. But I know that since then my relationship with the world has changed, with people, over time. With one's own idea of the future, everything became more fragile, most precious quieter, and it's even more impossible to explain. I keep walking, but now I pay attention to what's happening behind the scenes, in what is not said, in what does not appear, in what nobody asks, because that's where the hidden truth usually resides. And perhaps that's where my identity is still trying to reorganize itself, among what remained and what still insists on walking. If something like this also lives within you, tell me in the comments where your memory still hurts. When I heard those words, I didn't understand the meaning. I just felt I needed to obey, not because they were clear, but because they were inevitable, as if they hadn't been said directly into my head. But for some older part, quieter, more tired, my body responded before I could, and that scared me, because I always believed that decisions came from thought. But at that moment, they came from his absence. I moved without knowing why, without planning, without constructing meaning. And perhaps it was there that my relationship with control began to break down, because until then I thought that living was about making choices. But at that moment, to live was simply to obey. Have you ever felt that way? When something within you acts without asking your opinion, when the impact comes before the understanding, when memory begins to be created before understanding. After that, I never again fully trusted my own explanations. I started observing more, speaking less, listening to the silence as if it were always saying something I hadn't yet learned to interpret. I returned to the United States with this strange feeling of being in a familiar place, but with an identity that no longer matched the setting. The street seemed smaller, the sounds seemed higher-pitched, the conversations seemed faster, and I felt slow inside, not from tiredness, but in depth, as if everything had gained layers that no one around could see. I used to sit in bars with old friends. I listened to stories, laugh at the right moments. But inside me, that space still existed, that point where obedience had been the only possible language. I started to realize that many people live without noticing the behind-the-scenes aspects of their own decisions. They choose jobs, houses, relationships, as if everything were linear, as if identity were a straight line. But mine wasn't. Mine had curves. Courteous silences, empty spaces. I was trying to explain this to myself, but I always ended up giving up, because the hidden truth doesn't reveal itself when you force it. It only appears when you're too tired to control it. I began to feel that this obedience had been a kind of transformation, not in a nice way, but in the inevitable sense something had changed in me without my permission, and now I had to live with it. I noticed it in small things. The way I used to cross the streets, and the way I observed strangers, and the way I avoided certain looks because looking at someone for too long seemed dangerous, as if memory could slip through the eyes, as if someone could recognize something in me that I didn't yet know how to name. Sometimes I thought that those words hadn't been a command, but a mirror. They didn't tell me what to do. They simply showed me what I was still capable of doing, and that confused me, because I wasn't sure if I liked that version, or was she afraid of her. I started to wonder how many decisions in my life were still being influenced by that moment, how many choices were truly mine, and how many were still echoes. How many times did I obey without realizing it? How many times did I call intuition what was actually memory? How many times did I say everything was fine when I was just used to it? Silence began to become a companion, not an enemy. A place where I could feel without needing to explain, where I could exist without needing to justify myself. Where could I admit that I still didn't understand who I had become? I've come to distrust quick answers, of ready-made certainties, from people who claimed to know exactly who they were because I had already been someone like that. Before obeying without understanding, before feeling nameless, before realizing that identity is also built behind the scenes, in moments when no one is looking, in the seconds when there is no audience, in the moments when the hidden truth decides to breathe. I still remember walking down some random street, an ordinary street with ordinary houses with ordinary people, and to feel like I was carrying something that didn't belong in that setting. Not like a burden, but like a layer. Something that didn't appear, but it changed everything. The way I was walking, the way I looked, the way I took up space, I realized that my transformation hadn't been visible. Nobody congratulated me. Nobody commented. Nobody noticed. And that hurt more than I expected. Because part of me wanted someone to say, "I see you," even without understanding, even without knowing I see. But that never happened. And perhaps that's why I'm still speaking now. Not to explain, but to exist. Because talking isn't about concluding, it's about continuing to try to touch what's still in motion. I don't know exactly what those words were asking for, but I know they keep asking. In different ways, at different times, within decisions that seem simple, within silences that seem empty, within memories that seem distant, they still cross. They still cross the streets. People, thoughts. They still influence my way of being here. Now, even without sound, even without wind, even without repetition. And perhaps that's what scares me the most. Not what I obeyed that day, but how much do I still obey without realizing it? As if that part of me had never fully returned. As if I were still on that ground, looking at me, hoping that I will finally understand. Or perhaps, just hoping that I will continue. If any part of this resonated with you, tell me in the comments what still moves you in silence. It wasn't courage. It was desperation trying to look like faith. Courage is too beautiful a word for what I felt. She has a glow. It sounds like victory. There are people clapping during the movie. What I experienced there lacked any brilliance. It was just a raw need to keep breathing, and the feeling that if I stopped for a second I wouldn't come back inside myself. Despair isn't as noisy as people imagine. He is silent. He is practical. He makes you make decisions without explaining. He pushes your body forward and then leaves you alone with the memory of what you did. And the impact of that doesn't come immediately. It comes later, when you're in a typical American place, with a shopping cart in hand, staring down a cereal aisle, as if that could restore some semblance of normalcy. Have you ever stood still like this? In the face of simple things, feeling that simplicity is a long way off. I remember one morning I was in a Walmart parking lot, clear sky, people coming and going, kids with balloons, that normal sound of shopping carts hitting the asphalt, and suddenly I felt the same thing. Not fear, but the emptiness before the fear, that pause that seems to suck the sound in. Silence. This silence, which is not the absence of noise, is the presence of remembrance. My hand was on the car door handle, and I couldn't open it. My whole body really, but I felt like my identity was somewhere else, as if a part of me was still obeying. As if another part were still trying to resemble faith, because faith, the way I was taught, has always been a clean thing, an organized thing, one thing that people say out loud. But my faith was tainted that day. It was improvised. It was a kind of despair with a shameful hope in the middle, and I'm ashamed to say that sometimes, because I know how it sounds. It was as if I were trying to create meaning where there was only survival. But I'm not making this up. I'm just trying to get close to the hidden truth without making a spectacle of it. Do you understand the difference? It's not a story meant to seem strong. It's a story to try to be honest. In the backstage of my head, there's a place I always return to, not as an exact memory, but as a feeling. It's as if my body holds the map, and my mind has lost the address. And every time something in everyday life puts pressure on me, an overdue bill, a boss yelling, a neighbor arguing on the sidewalk, I feel that old transformation tugging at my shoulder, as if to say, "You've survived the worst. So why does this still break you?" And I don't know the answer. Because surviving is not the same as being whole. Survival is a type of decision made in the dark. No guarantee, no manual, no return. You just decide and follow through, and then carry on. Carry it for years. It carries in silence. Carries on parties, carries on family gatherings, it gets heavy on holidays that should be light. It comes across when someone thanks you for a service they don't even know how it was done. It comes out when a flag passes by in a parade and everyone applauds. And you applaud too, because that's what's done. But inside, you're trying to understand exactly what's being applauded. The act, or the absence of it. I have friends who manage to come back and fit in, or at least it seems that way. They talk about work, about sports, about plans. They have a routine. They have a way of being in the world. I observe and sense a strange mixture. Admiration, envy, A little bit of guilt. Because sometimes I think my identity got trapped in that despair, as if I were still trying to convince myself that it was faith, but perhaps it was just instinct. And if it was just instinct, what does that say about me? How does this change the way I see myself? The hidden truth is often like this. She doesn't destroy it all at once. She's peeling off layers. She starts to shed certainties. She's been working behind the scenes. And suddenly you realize you no longer know what courage is, and what is just well-disguised panic. And then comes the silence. That silence that won't let you go. He appears at random times. In traffic-numb drive-through. During a baseball game on TV with the volume low. He appears and stays. And sometimes I stay with him, because fighting against it is tiring. I've learned that there are days when you just sit and let the silence speak. Let him touch the memory. Let him show what's left. And what remains, almost always, is not the moment of danger. That's what you felt afterwards. It's a slow transformation. The way you started to distrust your own laughter. The way you started measuring the distance to the doors. The way you started needing to see people's hands. The way you started listening to the world as if it were about to change its tone. I don't like to admit it. Because I live here. I live here. I pay my bills here. I do ordinary things here. I am part of the American landscape. Long roads, gas stations with weak coffee flags on the balcony. People talking about freedom as if it had no cost. And I believe in that word. I truly believe it. But now I know that freedom can also be a burden. A weight of choices, of decisions from memories, behind the scenes footage that nobody sees. And the strangest thing is that I don't feel like a character. I feel like an ordinary person with an extraordinary story stuck to my insides, as if despair had left an invisible mark. Not in the body, but in the way I exist. I try to talk about this carefully, because I don't want it to become a symbol. I don't want it to become a cliché. I don't want it to turn into a cute little lesson. I just want to tell the hidden truth just as it is. Irregular, confused human. And perhaps that's why I keep returning to the point where everything seemed like faith, when in reality, it was desperation. And I keep wondering if there really is such a big difference. Because in the dark, sometimes despair is the only thing that makes you reach out. And perhaps that is faith too. Not the tidy faith, but faith that is born from a lack of options. Faith that doesn't use pretty words. The faith that only wants one more second, one more step, a chance not to disappear. I still live with that question, always with me. Not as a drama, but as a presence. And on good days, I almost forget. On bad days, I remember too much. And on quiet days, I just stay there, listening, waiting, trying not to pretend. If this resonates with any part of your story, tell me in the comments what silence you've learned to bear. After that, I could never hear silence the same way again. Before he was only absent. Now he is present. A presence that occupies space, that pushes thoughts, that pulls memories by the collar. Silence is no longer rest. It has become territory, and every territory bears its marks. I started noticing this in small things. The noise of the air conditioner when it suddenly stops. In the interval between songs on the car radio. The moment someone takes a deep breath before responding. It is in this space that memory arises. Not as an image, but what about the impact? I feel it first in my chest, then on the shoulders, then somewhere else, but I don't know the name. And I stay there, frozen inside a sound that doesn't exist. Have you ever noticed how silence is never the same? It has a comfortable silence, and there is the silence that observes. Mine learned to observe. He accompanies me to empty parking lots, at gas stations at 3 in the morning, in waiting rooms with old magazines. He sits next to me like someone who doesn't want to talk, but also doesn't want to leave. I began to understand that silence is where hidden truth often breathes. She doesn't speak loudly, she doesn't introduce herself, she just stays. And if you're not ready, it grows. I spent years trying to fill that void. With work, with routine, with distraction, with people, with noise. But he always came back, as if he were waiting for me to finally stop running. And maybe I've stopped now. Not out of courage, but because of tiredness. Because there comes a point when even escape loses its power. I realized this on a typical Sunday. Barbecue in a friend's backyard. Children running American flags waving in the wind. Laughter cups, low music. Everything seemed right. Everything seemed alive. And I was there. Completely. But not entirely. I heard the silence between two laughs. And it was there that something inside me stirred, as if to say, you're still here. But it's not just here. And I wasn't sad. I became aware that my identity had become layered and fragmented. One lives here. Another one lives on that ground. Another lives in that nameless space. And I carry them all, even when I pretend I don't, even when I say that everything is fine. Even when I believe for a few minutes, I started to realize that my decisions changed after that. Not major decisions, but the small ones. The way to choose a table, the way to sit near the exit, the way to observe hands, the way to listen to voice tones. These are invisible decisions. Behind-the-scenes shots where nobody sees, where nobody comments, where nobody asks. And perhaps that's why the most profound transformation is never noticed. It happens far from the applause. Far from pretty stories, it happens in silence. And silence doesn't post photos. I try to explain this sometimes, but it always seems like an exaggeration. It always seems like a drama. So I keep it, and when I store too much, it gets heavy. It weighs in a way that doesn't hurt, but it's tiring. It's exhausting to exist with so many versions inside. It's tiring to remember things that don't want to be remembered. It's exhausting trying to be simple when you know it's not anymore. It's exhausting trying to fit into conversations that don't know your memory. I realized that after that day I started to respect other people's silence more. When someone stops talking mid-sentence, when someone changes the subject too quickly, when someone smiles without their eyes, I see not with judgment but with recognition, as if to say from the inside, I know too. I carry it too. I also have behind-the-scenes information, because everyone has, some just manage to hide it better. And sometimes I think that my greatest fear isn't remembering. It's wrong to forget. It's transforming it into something it wasn't. It's about softening the impact. It's about polishing the hidden truth until it seems acceptable. I don't want it to be acceptable. I want her to be honest. Even when it hurts, even when it doesn't close, even when it doesn't explain, even when it doesn't console. Silence taught me this. Not everything needs to be resolved. Some things just need to be respected. Like a memory that is still trying to reorganize itself. As an identity that is still learning to recognize itself. Like a transformation that didn't ask to happen, but it happened. I walk down ordinary streets. I see ordinary people. I do ordinary things. But inside, I hear what is not said. I listen to what's left. I listen to what is still moving. I listen to the silence as if it had its own language. And perhaps it has a language made of pauses, of breaths, of spaces, of questions that don't require an answer. I don't know if I'll ever hear silence like I used to again. Maybe not. Perhaps this is part of who I am now, part of my story, part of my way of being. All I know is that he accompanies me, not as an enemy, but as a witness who saw things I still can't describe, and maybe I'll never know. And even so, he stays by my side, inside me, between one thought and another, between one decision and another, between one memory and another. And I continue, not because I know, but to continue with this silence that is no longer absence. But that's not an answer either. If this silence also walks with you, tell me in the comments how it sounds inside you. I returned home with medals, and with questions that nobody wanted to hear. The medals weighed less than the pauses, less than averted glances, less than the way people would change the subject when I took too deep a breath. They shone in the photos. They shone on the walls. They shone in their speeches. But they didn't say anything about the impact. Nothing about silence. Nothing about what happened behind the scenes. I used to walk through airports with people applauding, and I would applaud back with a borrowed smile. Have you ever applauded something without knowing exactly what it was? I didn't know if it was for me, if it was for them, if it was because of what had not been seen, if it was just to keep the scene running. And I kept. For a while I put the medals in a box, not out of shame but because of tiredness, because every time someone saw, the same question came up. How it was, and I always answered briefly, always shaved, always polite, because the hidden truth didn't fit there. She didn't fit in brightly lit rooms. It didn't fit into Sunday barbecues. It didn't belong at tables where laughter was easy. She needed silence, and nobody wanted silence. People wanted endings. They wanted a beautiful transformation. They wanted an organized identity. They wanted a version that made sense, and I was still in the middle of it. Amidst memories that didn't know where to go, in the midst of decisions that I still didn't understand, in the middle of a body that was here and from parts that hadn't arrived yet. I started to realize that asking hurts more than answering, because answering is just a matter of choosing words. Asking is admitting that you still don't know, and nobody wanted to listen to my questions, because they didn't have a quick response. They didn't have a catchy phrase. They didn't have a soundtrack. They only had weight. I was asking myself internally, who am I now? Who would I be if I hadn't gone? Who would I be if I had come back a different person? And nobody saw it, because on the outside I seemed whole. Too whole. I went back to the same street, the same facade, the same smell of freshly cut grass, the same flags on the balconies. But something in the scenario had changed. Or maybe it was me. Perhaps I had changed my place within things. I realized this when I tried to tell a story, and she didn't leave as before. She left broken, in pieces and silence, in sentences that died halfway through, and I saw the discomfort on people's faces, not due to a lack of empathy, but due to lack of space. There was no room for that. There were no hidden agendas behind that truth, and I saved it again. I put it away like someone closing a door slowly so as not to make a sound. I kept it as one who respects the silence of one's own impact. I started walking more alone, not out of sadness but out of necessity, not to translate. Walking alone was the only place where my identity didn't need explaining, where could my memory breathe, where my decisions didn't need to be justified, where could I exist without a caption. Sometimes I would sit on benches in ordinary parks. I watched children, dogs, people running, people living, and I thought about how everything seemed intact, as if the world had continued without stumbling. And perhaps it followed I was the only one who was on a different track, on another layer. In another silence, I felt like I was carrying an invisible version of myself, a version that only appeared when I stopped pretending to be carefree, when I let the silence in, when I accepted that transformation isn't always a pretty path. Sometimes it's just a series of internal adjustments that nobody notices. Sometimes it's just a matter of learning to sit with questions. Without demanding answers, I started writing again. Not to count, but so as not to lose, not to explain, but for the record. Impact, silence, identity, memory, decisions behind the scenes, hidden truth, transformation. I wrote those words as one leaves marks on a wall, not for decoration, but to remember that he was there. That existed. What did he feel? And the more I wrote, the more I realized that my questions weren't about the past. They were about the present, on how to continue living with things that don't close, on how to love without simplifying, about how to walk without passing out, on how to exist without shrinking. The medals were still in the box, not out of rejection, but because they only represented a part, and I didn't want to be just a part. I also wanted to be the questions, the silences, the hesitations, the breaks, the long gazes, thoughts that are not completed. I wanted to be whole in my imperfection. I realized that people like stories that have endings. I was living through one that just kept going on. No chapters marked, untitled, frameless. And perhaps that's why my questions bothered them, because they reminded us that not everything can be resolved. Not everything gets organized. Not everything turns into something beautiful. Some things just change places within us. I tried to talk about it carefully, but I always felt like I was speaking a different language, a language made of pauses, between the lines of silence, a language that few wanted to learn. So I started talking less, listen more, to observe more, because observing helped me realize that everyone carries something, even those who seem whole, even those who seem light, even those who seem resolved. Everyone has behind-the-scenes stories. Everyone has a hidden truth. Everyone has a part of themselves that doesn't come up in conversations, and perhaps that made me respect people more, and at the same time feel more distant from them, because respect can also be a form of silence. I still have the medals. I know where they are. I know what they represent. But today I also know what they don't represent. They do not represent my questions. They don't represent my long nights. They do not represent my silent decisions. They do not represent my inner transformation. They represent a cross-section. And I am more than just a cutout. I am also the space between the photos. Between the speeches, among the stories, among the expectations, I still walk down the same streets. I still greet the same people. I still live in the same city. But now I know that my real territory is elsewhere. It's internal. It is made of memory. It is made of silence. It is made of identity in motion. And maybe I'll never find the perfect words for it. Maybe I'll never be able to tell it the right way. Perhaps I will never know the answers to the questions I ask myself. But I continue, with medals in a box and questions while walking with me like invisible companions, as reminders that surviving is not the end. It's only a part of the story that continues to breathe. If you also carry questions that no one wanted to hear, tell me in the comments where they still reside within you. People said I survived, but nobody asked what I brought with me. Survival has become a comfortable verb for others. For me, it's become a question without context. Because surviving is not about returning. It's about crossing. And crossing leaves marks that don't show up in photos. I walked along clean sidewalks, illuminated shop windows, people talking about plans as if the future were a certainty, and I listened to everything with respect. But inside, I was still learning to occupy the present moment. I realized that nobody wants to know what we bring. They want to know if we left anything behind, because what we bring is too heavy for regular tables. It's impact without a caption. It's memory without a frame. It's an identity trying not to fall apart. I was bringing up decisions that I didn't remember making, reactions that didn't match simple situations, a silence that would enter any room with me. And I saw a kind of relief in people's eyes when I said I was okay, as if I were authorizing their comfort, as if my normalcy were more important than my hidden truth. I started noticing this at family gatherings, in past encounters and conversations where everyone was talking at the same time, and I was listening. I listened as if observing behind the scenes, not to judge but to understand, because I too had learned to hide, smiling at the right moment, responding within the expected time frame. Do not prolong breaks. Don't let the silence bother you. But he was annoying. Within always inside, I carried with me a transformation that no one had asked to see. A transformation without a beautiful narrative. No before and after. No trail, only one way. A constant medium, where I was still trying to recognize myself. I brought a different way of looking at people. A slower way. More careful, more suspicious. Not out of fear, but from memory. Because memory changes the way we trust. It changes the way we listen. It changes the way we exist. I also carried a strange sense of gratitude. Not because of the pain, but because I'm still here. And this gratitude was mixed with guilt. Guilt for being guilt for feeling guilt for not being able to be lighthearted, as if existing were a debt. And nobody saw it. Nobody asked. Nobody wanted to listen. And I didn't know how to say it either. So I learned to save. Store it like someone organizing a dark room. Without opening windows. Without changing furniture, just stacking impact. Silence, identity, memory, decisions behind the scenes. Transformation. Everything inside me. Everything's going well for me. I began to understand that survival is a word that protects whoever hears it, not those who live. Because those who live know that surviving is just the door. What comes next doesn't have an easy name. There is no set phrase. It has no place in quick conversations. And perhaps that's why I'm still speaking now. Not to explain, but so as not to pretend. So I don't have to pretend I came back whole. So as not to pretend that I only brought what fits. So I don't have to pretend I'm resolved. I brought things that are still moving. Things that are still trying to find their form. Things that they still don't know if they want to be remembered. Or forgotten. And maybe I'm learning to respect that. Don't force the meaning. Not rushing the transformation. Don't turn everything into a response. Because some parts of us just want to exist in silence. No function. No caption. No obligation. And I continue like this. With the body here. With memory passing through. With identity rearranging itself. With decisions being reviewed without warning. With behind-the-scenes information that nobody sees. With a hidden truth that doesn't want the spotlight. Just space. If you also feel you brought more than you were able to explain, tell me in the comments what you're still carrying with you. Sometimes I still wake up thinking those 3 words are being said again. Just to me. Not like sound, but as a direction. As if the air had decided to point out an invisible path. I slowly open my eyes. White ceiling. Light filtering through the curtain. Distant sound of a passing car. United States in operation. Normal world. But inside me, something is still in that second. That interval where memory chose not to end. I lie down for a few minutes, without moving as if any movement could break the connection with that echo. And part of me wants to break. Another part does not, because that's where the hidden truth still breathes. Not to hurt me, but to remind myself that I am not just what appears to be. I am also the one who insists on returning when no one is looking. I get up. I'm going to the kitchen. I open the refrigerator. I've left the door open longer than I need to, as if that cold could organize me from the inside out. Have you done this before? To stand still before something simple, just to feel that it's still here. I think about the decisions I've made since then. Some look like mine, others seem like echoes, and I no longer know how to separate them. Perhaps it's not necessary. Perhaps that's what identity is. A blend of choice and memory, a blend of willpower and impact, a mixture of silence and attempt. I drink my coffee while looking out the window. Neighbors leaving for work, children waiting for the school bus, dogs pulling on leashes, life happening, and I feel a strange gratitude, not because of the pain but for continuity, even imperfect, even confused, even without a manual. Sometimes I imagine what it would be like if those words had never been said, not to change history, but to understand who I would be without them. And that question doesn't hurt. It only exists like a piece of furniture that has always been in the same place, and you only realize it when you trip. I'm starting to notice how these three words still influence small things. The way I choose to sit, the way I look at exits, the way I listen to conversations, the way I distrust long silences, and the way I respect other people's silence. Because I learned that everyone has a backstory. Even those who seem light, even those who seem whole, even those who seem at peace, I'm not telling anyone. Not because it's a secret, but because I still don't know how to count. I still don't know how to put it into a sentence without losing the feeling. I still don't know how to translate without reducing. I still don't know how to explain it without sounding like an exaggeration. So I carry, not as a burden, but as a presence, as one who accepts that memory is also a form of companionship. And perhaps that's why I still wake up with the feeling that those words are spoken only to me, not as an order but as a souvenir, that I'm still here, that I'm still trying, that I'm still in motion, even when everything seems to stand still, even when the silence weighs heavily, even when identity seems unstable, even when the transformation is not yet form. I don't know if I'll ever stop listening. Maybe not. Perhaps this is part of who I am now, part of the way I navigate the world, part of the way the world affects me. All I know is that these words still walk with me, between one thought and another, between one decision and another, between one memory and another, as if they wanted to remind me that not everything that changes needs to be explained. Some things just need to continue being felt, and maybe that's what I'm doing. Feeling without concluding, without organizing, without closing, just letting it exist, however it works, the way it comes, the way it still pulsates. If these words also resonate with you sometimes, tell me in the comments when they usually reach you. And maybe they didn't just save my platoon. Maybe they were the only thing that kept me human. Human in the most fragile sense. Not a hero, not an example. Only someone trying not to get lost within their own memory. Because the real impact wasn't what happened outside. That's what remained. What continued to move behind the scenes. What began to reshape my identity without asking permission. I realized this gradually. In bank queues, in hospital waiting rooms, during American football games watched in silence on television. I realized that something within me was observing everything, as if it were always a little outside the frame. It was as if I were living and watching at the same time. And that wasn't distance. It was protection. It was the way my transformation found to exist. I began to understand that being human doesn't mean being whole. It is to be traversed, for decisions we can't explain, through silences we don't know how to name, for hidden truths that refuse to become public discourse. I looked at people and saw versions that they showed, versions they were hiding, versions that perhaps even they didn't know about. And I recognized that because I too was made of versions. The one who speaks it really sinks in. Which one reminds me? The one who pretends to forget the following. The one that's still on that ground. And none of them were wrong. They were all part. They were all memories in motion. They were all identities trying to stay afloat. Sometimes I thought those three words had been just an accident. One detail. A small noise amidst the chaos. But the more I traveled through this enormous country, along long roads, through cities that never sleep properly, the more I understood that small details change destinies, not like a movie but like breathing. Slowly, silent, irreversible. I started to notice how my decisions became more careful, no longer certain, just more aware. I didn't choose paths. I chose impacts. I didn't choose the answers. I chose what I could carry with me afterwards. And that changed everything. It changed how I love. How I trust has changed. It changed how I feel. The way I'm leaving has changed. Because when you learn that something so small can keep you human, you begin to treat the world with more silence. I don't eat fear, but out of respect, I still feel like part of me lives in the background, observing, taking notes, looking as if it were always ready to remind me of who I was, not to hold me back, but so that I'm not lying. And perhaps that's what those words still do. They don't save me anymore. They align me. They don't protect me. They remind me that I can still feel, that I can still hesitate, something I may not yet know, that I can still be human, even with everything broken, even with everything mixed together, even with everything incomplete. I don't know if that's strength. Perhaps it's just a continuation. But sometimes simply continuing is a kind of courage that no one applauds, a type of transformation that doesn't appear, a type of victory that only exists in silence. And I continue like this, with these words walking with me, not as an answer but as a presence that doesn't explain but it prevents me from disappearing, a presence that doesn't solve anything, but keep me here within completely, in every way possible. If this story also touched on something you've never been able to explain, stay with me here, and tell me in the comments if you also carry scars that no one sees. If you felt that this story stayed with you a little after listening, perhaps it's because it stayed with me as well while I was speaking. If you want to stay connected, sign up here, not as an obligation, but as someone who decides not to go through certain conversations alone. If any part touched on something you still can't explain, leave a comment. It doesn't even need to be long, just be honest. And if it makes sense, a like can stay there, as a silent gesture of support, without making a sound. I will continue speaking of these memories, of these identities in motion, of these silences that cannot be contained in sentences. In the next video, the conversation continues, not as an answer, but as company. I'm still thinking about all of this as I finish speaking, and maybe you are too.